Several years ago at the first conference I'd present my PhD research at, Naomi Klein was one of the featured speakers. It was at the University of Calgary at the Congress of the Humanities. And with great anticipation, I went to her talk, bringing along my children who were then 5 and 7, and also my parents. And we arrived to a packed auditorium where staff scrambled to set up chairs to accommodate the huge overflow in the lobby of the building outside of the doors of the room where Naomi Klein was to be speaking. The excitement at the opportunity to hear Naomi speak was evidenced by the demand and the numbers in the room, to what would end up being a standing room only crowd with the Fort McMurray fires in the background, a fossil fuel industry dominated province. Naomi Klein connected what was happening on the ground there in Alberta to the broader crisis of climate change. Her message that night, linking neoliberal policies with lack of action on climate change, and which drew strong support from the audience, is the message of so much of Naomi Klein's widely acclaimed work. She's an award-winning journalist, a regular columnist, and author of the New York Times and international best-selling books, No Logo, The Shock Doctrine, This Changes Everything, No Is Not Enough, and her recent book, On Fire. All of these have been translated into over 30 languages. She's a senior correspondent for The Intercept, Puffin Writing Fellow at Type Media Center, and a contributor for The Nation and The Guardian. Naomi Klein is the inaugural Gloria Steinem Endowed Chair in Media, Culture, and Feminist Studies at Rutgers University. She is also co-founder of the climate justice organization, The Leap, and a co-author of the Leap Manifesto. Klein's newest book, How to Change Everything, The Young Human's Guide to Protecting the Earth and Each Other, will be published in February of this year. I look so forward to an engaging discussion where we'll listen and learn from Naomi Klein about her work on climate action, climate justice, the Green New Deal, the LEAP Manifesto, and what lessons we can take here in Windsor, Essex, and across all our lands, where the climate emergency and climate justice movement require pressing collective action and coordinated organizing to put out the fire burning on our watch. So please join me in welcoming Naomi Klein. Welcome. So I, as Kim said, have the honor of asking you the first question this evening, and I'm sure it's an issue that's on everyone's mind because it's so current. So I'm going to bring up the Keystone Pipeline. I saw that you tweeted the other day asking Joe Biden to not get sucked in by Justin Trudeau's position supporting the Keystone Pipeline, a project which Biden promptly canceled. I want to ask you, how does the issue of oil pipelines and international trade relations impact local efforts on climate action? And why should we care here in Windsor, Essex, or elsewhere that Trudeau is supporting oil industry efforts in Alberta while the new US president is canceling such projects?
That's a great question. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Jane. It's a pleasure to be with you. Kim, Crystal, I'm just so looking forward to today's event and really delighted that we're able to have a conversation. Yeah, I'm not a fan of the Zoom lecture format. So I think the more we can actually have real conversations, the better. Yes, I did tweet that. I think I was remarking on the fact that Justin Trudeau, his first sort of communication with the new administration beyond just sort of a perfunctory congratulations was to push a pipeline and to stand in the way, really, of climate action south of the border, which is particularly ironic, I think, because something we often hear in Canada from our leaders as an excuse for why they aren't acting with more boldness and more in line with what climate scientists are telling us is that, oh, we're such a small player, right? So what does it really matter what little old Canada does? But of course it does matter precisely because we are a major exporter. And I think, my point with that tweet was, look at Justin Trudeau. He's been in power for 5 years. When he came when he became prime minister, there was all of this hope that he was, this great climate leader. He went to Paris, put his hand on his heart, said Canada is back, much as Biden is doing right now. And in comparison to Stephen Harper, it was a huge relief. And yet, we have spent those 5 years, when it comes to the climate file, pretty much fighting about pipelines, about all the different pipelines. And, I think we can all cite these different pipeline battles, but can we cite a major new renewable energy national infrastructure program that he can point to and say, look, this created jobs, this improved quality of life? And the fact that he can't and is still talking about sort of abstract issues around climate pricing, and when it comes to tangible infrastructure, talking about pipelines is exactly where we should not be 5 years into a government that said it was going to be different. It said it was going to provide climate leadership. It sucks up the oxygen, is one of the ways it affects us, right? And it maintains this false dichotomy that the oil and gas industry is the only way to create jobs. And so long as we don't build the alternatives in the real world in the same way that those pipeline companies are building their vision in the real world and creating real world jobs, we're going to keep losing that argument. And so it does affect us. It does affect the ability to have momentum for climate action, because we're wasting so much time fighting about this old infrastructure that really is not compatible with a 2-degree temperature target, let alone a 1.5-degree temperature target. We're already seeing devastating results, devastating impacts with a warming of 1 degree. So yeah, it does impact us.
I wanted to know what the last 4 years were like for you, because I know you've been paying attention to the UN said we have 12 years, that takes us to 2030. And then we had 4 years of Trump, and where he kind of showboated and made, he was really focused on going against the environment and going against being xenophobic, having racist comments and policies, and being anti-feminist. And so these are all the things that you care about. So what did that feel like for you to be watching the clock and have those 4 years?
Complicated, right? Because if I published This Changes Everything in 2014, and when I had an occasion to reread the introduction, somebody wanted to reprint it, and I was just doing like a very light edit on it. And I was really struck, when that book came out, it was treated as like quite an optimistic book. Like, we can do this. We've got a decade, right? But if you go back and you read it now and you realize, where we are six years later, and how little we've done, it's a much more sobering read, really. So what's it been like for me? I moved to the States, first of all. I've been living, I took this job at Rutgers 3 years ago. And I did it because, frankly, I wanted to be in the US during the Trump years. I know that sounds a little weird. I've lived in Canada my whole life. But I just thought that it was so important to really lose that little bit of distance that I've always had as a Canadian when it comes to American politics. I've always written about American politics, and I've spent a lot of time visiting the US and participating, but I've always had that sort of safe Canadian distance. And I felt like for the Trump years, I wanted to lose that and just really be in with both feet and be part of the movement that was emerging to try to get him out as soon as we could, and also be in a different place once we got him out, right? And that's what I would say about the moment that we're in right now, is that, if you look at the Biden administration, it's the same old in lots of ways, right? It's very familiar. There's something very 90s about the whole thing. And at minimum, it's a kind of a a return to the Obama era, and a lot of familiar Obama figures are going to power. But what I would say about the movements is that the movements are different. The social movements are different. You know, you put up that quote from No, It's Not Enough that I wrote. You know, I wrote No, It's Not Enough just a few months after Trump came to power. And I think that movements have done incredible work during these 4 years, beyond just saying no to Trump. I think that intersectional movement, cross-sectoral organizing has happened in a lot of spaces. You know, you think about just a few things that weren't happening when Trump came to power. The Sunrise Movement didn't exist. There was no discussion of a Green New Deal to speak of in the United States. The Black Lives Matter movement, though it had put out this forward-facing vision, wasn't leading with its alternatives of defunding the police, moving that funding to an infrastructure of care in nearly the way that it is now. And so it's actually, I think, quite remarkable that social movements managed to navigate the Trump era, doing more than just saying no to Trump, but actually developing bolder demands than they had during the Obama years. So my big fear with the Trump era is that we would end up kind of where we started, right? Of just kind of like, no to Trump, and that's the only thing we have to say. He's a fascist, let's get rid of him. And from a climate perspective, we can't just be where we were, because these are lost years. And so I would say that they weren't lost years. I think that that we laid a lot of groundwork. There's the urgency around climate action is much better understood. There's been a huge shift in polling, a huge shift in a sense of urgency, a much larger movement, a much more intersectional movement. And if you look at what Biden is doing, it's already much bolder than anything that we saw under Obama. Chuck Schumer was on Rachel Maddow last night, basically talking about the LEAP manifesto. You know, I mean, he was saying we need transformational climate action. We need to center racial justice. We need justice for fossil fuel workers and a real just transition and no worker left behind. You know, during the Obama era, these guys were talking about cap and trade. They weren't talking about a just transition. So we have made progress. We have to understand that. And so even if some of the faces are the same, in power, the movements have changed. The movements have used these years to go deeper.
And do you think that part of that was a response to Trump? Do you think that it intensified where we're at now in a positive way? You know, because they were reacting.
Yeah. I think that a lot of people really did understand that Trump was a sort of morbid symptom of a system in crisis. And that it couldn't just be, oh, this is a giant sort of clerical error, Russia interfered, we just need to go back to the good old days of Obama. And there are people like that who have that view. But I think from that the social movements, the activists really took Trump as a wake-up call to go deeper, to build different kinds of movements. And I don't want to overly romanticize it, because I think that there's still a ton of work to be done. And I could just as easily point to the limitations, but you asked me, Kim, about like just how it feels to kind of look at the climate clock, right? And know that we lost those 4 years. And I do want to say, I don't believe we lost them. We did not stand still during those 4 years. There was a huge amount of work that was done at the city level, at the state level, and within social movements, analytic work, and the kind of the radicalism of Gen Z is a real thing. And I'm sure you see this among your students. I mean, there's just, I noticed just in a 3-year period with the undergraduates who I teach, where it's just, this generation wants to go deep. They want to talk about the underlying systems, the connective tissue between the issues they care about. They're not interested in being stuck in silos of like climate over here, race over there, gender over here, economic justice over here. And I mean, I haven't even mentioned Bernie Sanders and what that produced, right? The beginning of the Trump era, AOC wasn't in politics. So there have been changes. There have been major progressive victories in this era.
When you talk about the coalitions of people coming together on race, on gender, on climate, but you also tweeted last night about the climate's a meta crisis. So can you talk about how important it is to build coalitions and how intertwined they are towards justice, but also climate change as a meta crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes people use this phrase, I hear among sort of climate professionals, where they talk about people being in the climate space, like I work in the climate space. And I always find that terminology so amazing, especially for people who work on climate, because we're all in the climate space. Like there's nobody outside of the climate space. And I mean, we are literally talking about the infrastructure of our planet that is in crisis. And so it isn't a hierarchy. It isn't about saying, and this is, I think, a huge error that environmentalists have too often made, to sort of to play this my crisis is bigger than your crisis. First, we have to save the planet, and then we'll worry about racism, and then we'll worry about poverty. But nothing matters if the earth burns. And I've been in meetings where people have said this, and it is a great way to build a very white, very middle class movement, because everything's in crisis. It isn't just climate. There's a crisis of white supremacy. There's a crisis of poverty and inequality and injustice. And if you are on the front lines of any one of those crises, it's existential for you, right? And so, white environmentalists coming along and saying, no, but this is existential, just communicates that you don't get it, right? That you don't actually have to worry. Edward Said, the famous Palestinian intellectual, once described environmentalism as like an issue for people who lack a proper cause. And I think that, I don't think he was discounting the reality of environmental crises, but he was sort of describing the profile of who was attracted to these movements. And so I think that this is where I think the environmental justice movement, the Indigenous leadership in Canada, I mean, who is leading the fight against these pipelines? It's Indigenous people, whether it's north or south of the border. And the urgency comes when people's water is at risk. I mean, I think about being at Standing Rock and the way people fought there to stop that pipeline that threatened Standing Rock's drinking water. It had a completely different quality of resistance because of that. And so it is a meta crisis. All of our crises fit within the infrastructure of our planet, but we can't conclude from that means that first we fix climate and then we worry about everything else. Because I think the way we build a movement with the urgency that we need is by connecting it with all of those other urgent crises.
I want to ask you about COVID, because that's obviously classic disaster capitalism. First of all, what are your fears about what's happening with around COVID, and do you see any opportunities that could be positive coming out of it?
I do. In terms of opportunities, I mean, I think that this should be a period where we are all contemplating what is essential in life. We maybe have more time to do it. Those of us who have the extraordinary privilege of being able to shelter in place, to be in our homes. And if we have that privilege, then we are acutely aware of who makes that possible. I mean, there has been, I think, an unveiling of the working class. I mean, it's being called essential work, but really we're just talking about the working class, the people who grow the food, stock the shelves, deliver it, make the stuff of life. And we live in a system that deliberately invisibilizes that. And I think one of the first things that happened with the pandemic, when we weren't sure how it was spreading, if it was on surfaces, or if it was just airborne. It made us acutely aware of the central lie, I think, of capitalism, which is the idea of 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 individual self-sufficiency. None of us are islands. We are in a web of interdependent relationships that are rendered invisible by various lies that we tell ourselves. And I think that this crisis, as so many crises do, just pulled back the veil, and we had to think, well, who touched what I'm touching? Who touched who touched this doorknob? Who touched this box? And there was this, I think, outpouring of love for the people who were keeping us alive. So we need to hold on to that. We need to build on that. And I think as we reopen, when we get on the other side of this, I don't think we should go back to normal. Normal was a crisis. We need to be more selective about what we tell ourselves we can't live without. I hope that we've learned that we can travel less. I feel like that's one of my biggest takeaways is I don't want to go back to the amount of travel and fossil fuels I was burning before. I want my travel to be essential. And I think that that's the sort of governing principle that we need in our lives right now. We are in a climate emergency, and we need to pare things down to what is essential, and we need to do what is required in the face of the crisis. So I think that one of the things we have learned, Kim, I think, and this is where my most positive spin that I can give is, I've noticed a huge shift since I've been talking to people about the climate crisis over the past decade. In the year before the pandemic, I spent a lot of time talking to people. I published on Fire. I did a lot of events with Sunrise. I noticed a huge shift in people's sense of this is a real crisis. Yes, capitalism is in conflict with what we need to do in the face of the crisis. Yes, it requires massive change, but we can't do that. We as humans are not capable of massive change. So I was not encountering ideological debates like, can market mechanisms actually solve this for us? I was having those debates when This Changes Everything came out or when the LEAP manifesto came out. Now it was, are we doomed or are we not doomed, right? Are humans capable of massive change on a deadline? And so I guess the shiniest silver lining I can come up with when it comes to COVID is we all now have bodily experience of massive change. And Kim Stanley Robinson, the science fiction writer, talked about how we have this feeling that we all now have a feeling that we're in a science fiction novel that we're writing together. So, when I was writing on Fire, I was using the example of how we changed during the Great Depression or after the Second World War. But that was before I was alive. And now we can say, okay, well, we faced a crisis by shutting everything down that we needed to shut down, by retooling factories to produce essential medical gear. By handing communication over to scientists and experts and saying we have to be guided by science. So I think we have a better sense now of what Greta is out there day in, day out saying, treat it like an emergency, right? And I think now we know what that means a little bit more. And it's so clear that we, to some extent, are treating COVID like an emergency, though not enough, and certainly not in Ontario, or at least not until recently. But we are not treating the climate crisis like an emergency.
Yeah, and I'm interested in why that is. So, so you speak really eloquently about Greta Thunberg and how part of the reason that maybe can be so direct and telling us that the house is on fire is that she's not mirroring. So I'm just interested in asking you, what is it about human nature that has taken us this narrative about the threat of climate change has been around for decades, and we're a very smart animal. And so why have we been so stuck? It just reminds me of, I guess it's social mirroring, that when it comes to things like the Twin Towers or the Korean ferry disaster in 2014, or the Beverly Hills Supper Club that burned down in 1977 in Kentucky, when like literally the building was on fire, and when people are told, stay in your seats, it's going to be okay, a lot of them will do that. And some people will run to the exits, but a lot of them will stay in their seats. And we're in a situation where people are staying in their seats and there are no exits. So, we're really kind of trapped in this together. So I'm interested in your thoughts and what is with human nature. Is it the systems that we're in? Is it the way we're socialized? Is it greed? Like, what is it that's made it so intractable for so many years?
The argument I make in This Changes Everything is that it really is that we have suffered from this profound case of bad historical timing. If we look at the sort of key moment when governments got serious about the climate crisis and had the first intergovernmental meetings and created the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that was 1988. Canada hosted the first meeting in Toronto. And there was all of this, there was all of this momentum and goodwill. Nathaniel Rich wrote this huge piece for the New York Times that got turned into a book about, how 1988 was the moment, right? And we knew it, and we were going to act, but then somehow we didn't. And he says the answer was human nature. It was too far off, and we couldn't, act in the face of a far off threat. My analysis, as somebody who's been part of the movements against neoliberal capitalism for a long time, is that 1988 was the year before the Berlin Wall collapsed. It was the first year that the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement came into force. It was the moment that the new world order was being declared under Clinton. And it was the ascendant moment of the neoliberal project. I mean, 89, this is Francis Fukuyama declares history over. Margaret Thatcher had told us there is no alternative. So it was the absolute ascendant moment for the ideological project of privatization, deregulation, laissez-faire capitalism, get out of the way of the markets. And we have a generation, multiple generations now, of politicians who grew up utterly indoctrinated in that worldview. They don't want to govern. They don't even know how to govern. All they have done is unmake institutions, and their major governing achievements, as they see it, have been outsourcing and deregulation. And so, the climate crisis is a crisis that demands action. It demands. My brother Seth Klein has a wonderful book out. Sorry to be nepotistic. It's called The Good War, and it's the lessons from what Canada did during the Second World War for the climate crisis, right? And he tells this incredible story of what Canada did during the Second World War. What Canada did during the Second World War in terms of creating all of these crown corporations to produce the armaments of for the Second World War, the munitions, what the kind of activist government that happened in that period, and it's totally antithetical to the way politicians think now. The good news, I would say, is that I think the neoliberal project has been in profound crisis since the financial crisis in 2008. I think there is now a new generation of politicians that actually wants to govern, not just that wants to make, not just unmake the state, and they're vying for power, and I mentioned Bernie Sanders. That was an extraordinary experience to be part of that campaign and see how many millions of people were drawn to that vision. I don't think it was a nostalgic vision. Bernie had the boldest Green New Deal plan of any politician so far who's run a serious campaign anywhere in the world. He really listened to social movements. He really put climate justice at the center. So that's what I attribute it to, more than anything else, is this historical mismatch between the kinds of things we need to do in the face of the crisis, which involves regulating corporations, taxing them, bringing things into the public sphere that can't be left to the market, and this ideological project that was telling us, no, we need to actually outsource everything to the private sphere, get out of the way, deregulate. It's just a mismatch. But I do believe that we have a chance to truly bury neoliberalism right now, and that's what we have to do. I don't think that we act in the face of a climate crisis within the confines of neoliberalism.
Yeah, and you mentioned the World War II mobilization that Seth
Mhm.
Klein writes about. There's so many historical precedents that get mentioned in terms of what we need to do. So the Marshall Plan, some people call for a Manhattan Project, New Deal, of course, with the Green New Deal. Also, there's other precedents of smoking. I've heard you talking about the fact that you quit smoking because you became a social pariah, and that was a pretty major lift with the smoking companies. And also healthcare in Canada, and bringing in healthcare into Saskatchewan and into the country was not easy. So what do you draw from those? Are you most attracted to the New Deal, or what elements from history will help us make the changes we need to make right now?
You know, I've always sort of shied away a little bit from the Second World War analogy, because I don't like the idea of a war, thinking about it as a war, and because I think there's a sort of a danger where we sort of pit ourselves against the natural world even more than we do now. Um, Climate is not our enemy. Climate change is our enemy. Fossil fuels are that are at this point our enemy. But I'm just not sure that enemy discourse is all that helpful. I think I'm more comfortable sort of seeing like greed as our enemy. And like, I guess coming back to what I was saying earlier, I mean, I think we really need a different worldview that recognizes interdependence. And I worry about where some of the militaristic rhetoric gets us, which is why I prefer the New Deal era, which I think we just have a lot in common with, in the sense of we have you have an a profound economic crisis, obviously the Great Depression. You also have rising fascism. You also have an ecological crisis in the U.S. with the Dust Bowl, also in parts of Canada, and this need to solve multiple problems at once. And so so many, I think, New Deal programs would be so welcome in a moment like this, like the Civilian Conservation Corps, which planted more than 2 billion trees and built hundreds of state parks. If we did something like that in Canada, and it's something that Justin Trudeau has talked about, I would think that it would need to be led by First Nations. It would need to be married to the land back movement, rather than it just being, planting a whole bunch of tree farms on Indigenous land. That's green colonialism. That's not what we need. But I think that, thinking about the role of, rewilding the world and sequestering carbon is absolutely key. Um, Another part of the New Deal that I find really important right now is the National Youth Administration, which created millions of jobs specifically for young people. The CCC also created jobs specifically for young people. But when I think about, the young people who are listening to us, university age young people and younger, I just don't think we're offering nearly enough to them right now, to what it means to be preparing for a future in so many different forms of crisis. Obviously, we're talking about the climate crisis, but the economic crisis that they are graduating into, and also I think the psychological crisis that predates COVID, but has been greatly intensified by it. That there is a profound mental health crisis. It's not only for young people, but it is more intense for young people. And one of the things that um, I'm always struck by when I look at New Deal history is that when leaders in that era talked about the Great Depression, they weren't only talking about it as an economic state. You know, when we talk about the Great Depression, we're talking about economic indicators. Um, but when they talked about the Great Depression, they were talking about the psychological state of the people as well as the economy. And so when you had these programs that invested in people's right to access nature, or their right to dignified work, or their right to participate in the arts. There was huge funding for the arts under the New Deal. It was about not just creating economic stimulation, it was also about addressing people's spiritual and psychological needs, including the need for a shared mission and a shared project. And I think we really need that right now. And I think young people deserve it. And we need to think at that kind of scale. How do we solve multiple problems at once? Create jobs and battle climate change, and get people in community and in common purpose, and maybe away from screens, because it's not doing any of us any good to be on screens this much.
Notwithstanding tonight, which is
Except
for a
for
good
tonight.
cause.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're at the point where we're going to open things up to the audience Q&A. So I'd just like to invite Crystal Bryan onto the screen to explain how you can ask your question.
Thank you so much, Kim. Hi, everyone. Thank you for everyone that has joined us and continue to join us and has been here so far. I was just engrossed in Naomi's just speaking and all of that. So here's a time where you get to ask your questions. I have seen quite a few of them coming in. So when you look at your taskbar at the bottom, you're going to see like 2 question bubbles. It's going to have Q, the and sign, and A. You can just type your question in there if you just want to ask your question and you don't want to come onto the screen. And then your second option that you do have is the raise hand functionality, which should be right beside it. If you do want to ask Naomi a question on screen like we are right now, please feel free to raise your hand. We'll try to get to as many as we can, but in order to do that, we're going to have to keep the questions really short, all right? Looking forward to hearing from all your questions, and back over to you, Kim.
Thanks. The first question we have is from Narika. She said, we recently received news that the federal government will be investing $13 billion into the climate plan. What hopes do you have for this massive investment?
I think it is too small. I know it sounds big, but you know, it's barely more than they've spent buying pipelines between Trans Mountain and Keystone. We need more. And you know, at this point in the crisis, we don't get A's for effort, and we really have to think on a different scale. And we're not seeing it yet. We're not seeing it yet. But it's a start. Start's not good enough. You know, we launched the LEAP Manifesto 5 years ago because we wanted to have, you know, in the name, the imperative to get past this idea that, well, just a couple steps in the right direction are sort of inherently good. You know, Bill McKibben says that winning at this point, winning slowly is the same as losing when it comes to the climate crisis. Scientists have told us that we need to cut global emissions in half in a decade. And so this is where I agree with the idea of a kind of a wartime mobilization. When you understand that you really are up against it in that way, you spend whatever it takes. You spend whatever it takes to get the job done, because the alternative is unthinkable and the costs are beyond our imagining.
There's a question here. I'm glad that it's being asked, because I did want to ask you about the billionaire savior complex. So Ayesha asks, Elon Musk recently tweeted about carbon capturing technology. What are your views on this? Will it help our climate or not?
I think that we should be taxing billionaires at a much, much higher rate. I think we should be talking about income ceilings. I think it is obscene how much wealth Elon Musk has accumulated, especially during the pandemic. And he knows he has a PR problem, which is why he's making these announcements. They are afraid of being taxed. And so, I am having some deja vu here because we've seen precisely this sort of splashy announcement from billionaires who feared regulation in the past, and this changes everything. I have a chapter called "The Billionaires Won't Save Us," where I talk about Richard Branson making what at the time was the largest charitable announcement ever at the Clinton Global Initiative, promising to put all of the profits from his airlines into solving the climate crisis, a miracle carbon capture and storage scheme. And there was a prize that was announced, and it's very, very similar. First of all, there's no accountability. It turned out he didn't donate it at all. He donated a fraction of it, but if it's all voluntary, there's no mechanism to hold these guys responsible and accountable. The news cycle moves on, and then they just don't do it. The benefit of government is we do have some mechanisms. We have elections. We have systems of accountability. This just isn't an efficient way to do the most important thing that we have to do, which is save our one and only home. So, yeah, I don't hold out hopes that Elon Musk is going to save us. It doesn't comfort me that he's planning his own escape route from our planet.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask you about, the Mars death cult. But Dana's got a question. What are some actions we can take on an individual and societal level to treat climate change like the emergency it is?
Well, it's interesting because if we did treat it as the emergency that it is, it would change every aspect of our lives. I mean, that would be an impossible question to really provide an answer to, because when we really acknowledge that the urgency that we face, and there's been resolutions passed saying that we recognize we're in a climate emergency, but when you are in an emergency, things change quickly. They don't change 10 or 15 years from now. We see the changes right away. And like I said, I think we've experienced some of what that means right now. I mean, you're locked down pretty much in Ontario because you're facing an emergency, and it requires these kinds of disruptions. What climate demands of us is not nearly so unpleasant, right? I mean, once we're through COVID, we actually need to get together and do all kinds of things that will nourish and sustain us. I've mentioned a few of them, the examples from the New Deal era of the sorts of things we would need to see. But we need to transform how we live in cities. We need huge investments in transit. I think we need to think about things like making public transit free to incentivize people to use it. There are examples that we can point to, like cities like Barcelona that are really leading on this and have been involved in a process of kind of taking their cities back from cars, having these sort of super blocks where it really becomes public space and people take the city back. I know that's maybe a little bit controversial in a city that builds cars, but Windsor doesn't only need to build cars. I mean, Windsor can build all kinds of things, including public transit.
Bruce has a question. He asked, does any political party speak to your ideals? Does the NDP's failure to endorse the LEAP manifesto lessen your desire to support a party that has such close ties to your partner's family?
Well, first of all, the NDP did endorse the LEAP manifesto. It's just that after it endorsed the LEAP manifesto, they just didn't kind of do much about it because there was a huge, there was a huge tension with Rachel Notley's NDP, which was in power in Alberta at the time. And I think, I don't envy the NDP federal leadership for, navigating, a provincial party in power for the first time in Alberta, and being out of power nationally. Of course, I wish the NDP did more. I wish that it had taken that message from its base when the base voted to endorse the principles of the LEAP manifesto, and to do a process riding by riding to really figure out what that would mean and what that would look like. And and the party, I don't think did that in a very meaningful way. I don't think that most people who are active in the party probably experienced much of that. Um, but I'm encouraged to see a change in rhetoric, in recently. But I'm never satisfied with what political parties are doing, and maybe that's why I'm not in politics myself. Um, but yeah, we won't get into family dynamics. I would just say,
People like to do that with you.
Avi's always pushing the NDP as well, and yeah.
We have a student named Solange asking, what as young people and professionals can we do to quickly become involved in an environmental justice-based career?
That's a very good question as well. I find it, I do always find it a little bit hard to give sort of general career advice without knowing you. And I think that, coming back to what I was saying earlier, if this is an emergency, it changes every field, right? It changes what artists are doing. It changes what psychologists are doing, what sociologists are doing, what geographers are doing. It demands of us to look at all of our fields, our passions, and sort of figure out, how can I connect this to this meta crisis, right? So I don't think that it demands of us that we all just sort of drop whatever we were doing and focus on this one thing. And so this is our life's work, all of us. This isn't something, this is where it's very different from COVID, right? Is that it isn't like there's a shot and then we're done, this is our work. It's multi-generational work. So it's important, as you choose your career, that you do something that you are going to stay with. If you decide to do something because it's good for climate, but it's not something that you're particularly interested in, you probably are going to lose interest and not have a very fulfilling experience, and maybe not stay in it. So whatever it is, make sure that it's something that you can commit to, that you can sustain, and then transform. There's a campaign that just kicked off a week ago, from some of the people who brought you fossil fuel divestment, calling for people who work in advertising and creative industries to not make advertisements for fossil fuel companies anymore. And I think that just sort of shows that whatever field you're in, like if you're in marketing, if that's your passion, if you want to, you want to do that kind of communication, you have a question to ask yourself about whether you are going to go along with plans to make ads for fossil fuels, or whether you're going to organize your coworkers and draw the line and say, we won't be part of that. We've seen pretty amazing things from tech workers. I'm in touch with workers at Amazon, for instance, who started a group called Amazon Workers for Climate Justice. And they have been calling out Jeff Bezos and demanding that they not provide cloud services for oil and gas companies. That's the kind of thing that's happening in every single industry. So I don't think it's about there are some jobs that you can get at a climate justice ENGO, but there aren't enough jobs to go around. So if you care about climate justice, I think it's more urgent that we figure out how we're going to transform every single industry and sector.
So we have Bonnie who is going to ask a question on screen. So go ahead, Bonnie.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you so much, Naomi, for being with us here in Windsor. You said something tonight that I have not heard. And I realized when you said it that I've never heard it said out loud. And it wasn't, we must end neoliberalism. It was, we could end neoliberalism. And there's something really powerful in that could. And I wanted to ask you if you would say a little bit more about how do we do it? What are your thoughts?
How do we do it? Well, thank you for that. And I really do believe that we can, which is different than saying that we will. And I think that I have to say, I am really inspired after having spent a couple of years in the US. And I realize that sounds very weird, having, come from a country in that state. But I was really inspired by how many people were going into politics themselves, how many young people were just putting themselves up at the local level, at this at the subnational level and federally, very young people, and just taking that risk, but also people who weren't going into politics themselves, but were like on the outside and interfacing with it. So if I look at a group like Sunrise, which is a youth-led climate movement, it has chapters in middle schools and high schools, and of course on university campuses. Sunrise has put the Green New Deal on the national stage. They occupied Nancy Pelosi's office in 2018 with a vision that frontally attacked neoliberalism. Because what is neoliberalism? It is a war against the New Deal. It is a counter-revolution against the idea of an activist state. It was, in the shock doctrine, I told the story of how it was, hatched in certain think tanks with the help of certain economists and exported globally, right? And so it's very strategic to call it a Green New Deal, and because it strikes at the heart of the neoliberal project. And so it is an inside-outside approach. It takes those movements pushing. It takes people on the inside, like AOC, 29 years old at the time, before she'd even been sworn in, going into the occupation of the future Speaker of the House's office and giving them the high five and saying, "I'm going to do it. I'm going to write the resolution." So in Canada, we just have to do this. And I think we have some examples of sort of squad-like figures now in the NDP. I was asked about the NDP. I mean, I love Matthew Green, Leah Gazan. Like, I think we're developing our own squad. And I think that we're seeing this, in the NDP, in the Greens, and it's in that interplay is all I can say. And the really, really bold demand. And, you can ask about like how I feel about the leadership of the NDP, and I'll say what I say, but it's not coming from leadership. It's coming from like first time, first elected, just elected, not waiting their turn, going in there, going big. They've changed the game. They've changed the game. Now you have Chuck Schumer, like I said, majority leader in the Senate, talking about essentially the Green New Deal on television last night because they did this. They forced his hand. He is a neoliberal politician who's not talking like a neoliberal anymore. And neither is Joe Biden. It's hard for him, I'm sure, because he really is a neoliberal. So it's an interesting moment. And, being part of the Sanders campaign was maybe the best political experience of my life. And I'll always be grateful, for having had that bodily experience of being in stadiums with him and AOC and tens of thousands of everyday people, multiracial, multi-generational, cross-sectoral, who were so ready for it. So I will never believe again that these ideas are unpopular. I was in Las Vegas when Bernie won. Vegas, when he swept the Strip, right? The shiniest, fakest casino capitalism place of them all, the Citadel. And the people who scrubbed those slot machines rose up and said, "No way, we want Medicare for all and a living wage and a Green New Deal," And if it can happen there, it can happen anywhere.
Thanks. We have a question. This will be our last question we'll be able to get to. Unfortunately, we've got some great questions about a mega hospital they're trying to put into Windsor. We have a great question about how can we afford with our deficit to do these things. But the last question I'm going to ask is, what are your this is from Rachel, what are your possible suggestions for holding our current Canadian government officials accountable to do what they should be doing while we wait, long overdue, for radical progressive politicians and parties to be elected? Can we afford to wait for such people and parties to come into office?
Can we afford to wait? I think that there are some people in there now who would want to work, and are working on the inside. And I think that's true, at the provincial level. I think it's true federally. I think it's an interesting moment, honestly, to exert pressure, a really important moment, because I don't think Trudeau wants a spring election right now. His numbers don't really support it. They're screwing up a bunch of things at the moment. I think he was hoping to sort of ride a kind of "we did it better than the United States" on the pandemic and get a majority out of that. but I actually don't think this is their moment to have an election. And because of that, it's a moment to demand a lot more on the climate front for the NDP, for the Greens, for movements, because I don't think that they're going to be willing to just go, forget it, we'll just have a snap election, at least not in the next few months. So yeah, I mean, I personally like minority governments for this reason. I think they're more porous. I think that they're not able to just do what majority governments in a system that doesn't have proportional representation does, which is just do whatever they want. So I think we should make the most of this minority period to apply maximum pressure for a real just recovery, a justice-based recovery that marries the need for bold climate action to the need to revive our economy. And we need that kind of multitasking.
Well, we've such great questions, and I'm so sorry we can't get to all of them. Questions about the curriculum in elementary and secondary schools, about climate change, and about how do we convince Albertans to retool from oil and gas. These are really, really excellent questions, and I'm sorry we can't get to them because we're after 8 o'clock now. So that's all the time we have for tonight. And I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. I want to give a huge thanks to Brent Lee he's the composer of our music, to Yvonne Zimmerman, to Jane MacArthur, who you met, to Crystal Bryan, who runs these with me. Huge thanks to Nick Hector for making this happen tonight. And I want to dedicate tonight to Pat Noonan. She is somebody that Naomi Klein would have loved very much. She was such a committed activist, committed to anti-war, harm reduction, feminist causes, and really hugely into the environment. She was in for anything social justice. And she was really a thorn in the side in anybody who wasn't. So I just want to say huge thanks to Pat Noonan and dedicate this evening to her and to her memory. And a huge thanks to you, Naomi Klein, for all of your courage, for holding the powerful to account, for not giving up, for fighting trolls, and just being such a courageous role model and a national treasure.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much, Kim, and all the amazing women who made this possible. And Nick Hector, who, by the way, little known fact, was the star editor for This Changes Everything, and who I adore. And I'm just looking at these like dazzlingly smart questions. There are so many of them. It's really inspiring. And yeah, this was so fun for me.